This is the John Wood Jr. Show, a product of Braver Angels Media. Thank you very much, folks. It is great to be with you here today. I have with me, as a guest of the John Wood Jr. Show, an individual who, frankly, many of you will be well familiar with. He is a long-standing voice on talk radio. He is the founder of Prager University. He is an individual who has had a deep and indelible impact on the moral, cultural, and political conversation, and religious conversation, for that matter, in American life across many years now. Somebody I've had the pleasure of learning quite a bit from over the airwaves over the course of my few decades on this rock as well. And so I bring to you folks Mr. Dennis Prager. Dennis, how are you doing today, my friend?
Thank you, John. That's a very sweet introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, indeed. So Dennis, you and I were talking a little bit before we started rolling the tape here about the project of Braver Angels and the prospects of sort of fostering dialogue between right and left, and the difference between fostering dialogue between conservatives and liberals on one hand and leftists on the other hand. And so I want to get into all of this terrain as we go. But I want to start things off very quickly by leveraging a little bit of personal sentiment here, even more so than I've already done, because I've got to tell you that speaking to you is a very special thing for me, because like so many folks, I was more or less raised listening to you on the radio. You have long been one of my father's favorite people on the airwaves, and I'm in the privileged position, having you on the line here, of being able to maybe toss a couple of questions at you that I was never quite able to get through on the call lines because they're always always so busy, right? So this first question may seem like it comes from left field a little bit, but you'll see that there is a reason for it. What does the name Benny Leonard mean to you, Mr. Prager? Born Benjamin Lanier. Are you familiar with the life and legacy of Benny Leonard? And if so,
I don't know if it's the Benny Leonard you're referring to. I only know and vaguely of a Benny Leonard who was a boxer.
Indeed, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, Benny Leonard of fistic glory. My father has always wondered if you had a particular sort of relationship or insight into Benny Leonard, because Benny was lightweight champion of the world. Now this is going back in time, from 1917 to 1925. He was the most famous, I suppose, Jewish athlete and certainly Jewish boxer in America, and he was from the Upper East Side, which is, I believe, of Manhattan, which, if I'm not mistaken, is that where you are from originally? Or?
I'm from Brooklyn, actually. From Brooklyn.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Outstanding. Right.
Not far away.
Not far away. There you go. And so certainly, you would know the world that Benny Leonard came from. Now, he would have passed away, I think, a little bit before you were born. I think that you and my father are the same age. My dad was born in 1950. And so the reason I mentioned that is because I was raised with sort of a storyline from my father. I come from a music family. My father's a jazz pianist. My mother is a rhythm and blues singer. She danced on Soul Train in the late 70s and 80s. My dad raised me to believe that you go back in time when, in his words, when America was truly at its best, in his memory, in his mind, in the 1950s and the 1960s. There were certain things that we had in common as a culture in American society, which gave us the opportunity to relate to each other on some level, left and right, black and white, everything in between, in spite of all of the social and political turmoil that characterized those years. One thing that we had in common was sports. The heavyweight champion of the world was somebody that people knew from one side of the country to the other. Now it's kind of hard to name who that individual might be. my dad is fond of telling me that everyone in America knew what was number one on the pop charts back in the late 50s and 60s and so forth, and that good music spurred the civil rights movement. And point of context there, my father's father was a man named Randy Wood. He was the founder and president of Dot Records, which was the largest independent record label in America in the late 1950s. Apples and Bananas, which is the Lawrence Welk song that you have played on the as the lead-in for the Happiness Hour, is actually a Dot record. It came out in
Really? Wow.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Lawrence Welk was my grandfather's best friend back in those years. And so, I was, and granted, there's perhaps some nostalgia in this, but I was raised with this storyline that said that once upon a time, there were certain things in our culture that gave us a bridge to perhaps understanding and empathizing with each other. Empathize is probably not a word my father would have used, but that we had certain things in common, and that having things in common was necessary for us to be able to progress as a society. And my father would cite baseball and boxing and music as part of the great elements of American popular culture that made it possible for us to move forward. So I wanted to pause with that a little bit, because I know my father has always wanted to ask you about sports and music and the greatness of American popular culture back in those years. I deliver this little this perspective to you, wondering what you make of that particular analysis, and what you see the role historically of American popular culture and some of these things as in terms of how they may have served our ability to get along with each other, or not. So what do you make of that recollection?
Your father was a wise man. Let me just say that.
Is a wise man.
I'm sorry.
Yes. I should say. Indeed.
Correct. Is a wise man, I'm happy to say.
Mm-hmm.
We had in America a lot of things that unified us. Pop culture is certainly one of them, and sports is certainly one of them. Thanksgiving is an example. We had holidays, July 4th, Thanksgiving, even Christmas. I'm a religious Jew. Christmas is not my religious holiday, but we had Christmas in America. It was a Jew. In fact, Jews wrote the most popular Christmas song. Half of the most popular Christmas songs were written by Jews. That's a statistic. It's not an opinion.
No, that's true.
Actually, a statistic. The New York Times had an article on this a number of years ago. So we shared a tremendous amount. We all sang the Star Spangled Banner at the beginning of the game, or we at least stood for it, took our hats off. Every one of the things that we had in common, popular culture, sports, Thanksgiving, has been blown up by the left, not by liberals. Liberals still share that. And that's new in American life. We shared a belief that it was a good thing, with all the suffering that happened, and we all acknowledge it. It was ultimately a good thing that America was created in North America, that the United States was created. The left does not believe that. It's why Columbus Day is considered a rotten day, not a holiday, and it's actually been removed. Everything that we shared has been changed. We have BLM posters on stadiums in the past year. You couldn't even sing the national anthem with an entire football team out there, because either they were not standing or they didn't show up for the national anthem. This is all new. Late night television. Johnny Carson was an American phenomenon. Everybody watched him. His belief, to this day, I don't know Johnny Carson's politics. I don't know if he was liberal or conservative. Nobody cared. Johnny Carson believed it was his task to make Americans laugh after another difficult day of life, because life is difficult, and certainly for most people, but not anymore. Late night television, late night so-called comedy is as political as CNN, or for that matter, Fox, if you will. It's just political. So we don't have anything. The left has destroyed everything we have in pop culture, sports, late night television, you name it. It has now been thoroughly politicized. That's not an opinion, in my opinion. That's a fact.
Yeah.
If somebody had taken a knee, had not stood for the American flag because they were pro-life, I would have been as opposed to that as I am to Colin Kaepernick. That is not the place to inject your politics. You are there to stand for the flag that people died for, of every color, and you can have your opinion off the field, but on the field, the only colors that matter outside of the red, white, and blue of the flag are the colors of the team. So that if I sat next to a Democrat and we both rooted for the Dodgers, to give my LA example, or the Angels, that's all that mattered. Nobody cared. He and I are rooting for the home team, root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. We stood for the seventh inning. What is it again? The seventh inning stretch.
The seventh inning stretch.
And that's the way it was in all of American history till the last few years. And the left has just shattered it all.
So there is, I share a deep point of agreement with you, which is that we live in a society where it seems to me, at least, that politics, which somebody said to me the other day, that politics in some sense ought to be sort of close to the last sort of, place where we go to sort of deal with our differences with each other. But instead it's become the very first place. What used to be, I think, located in a certain lane of activity in American life is now spilled out to every facet of our existence. And so, just like you say, sports and entertainment and, the classroom, even if you're studying biology or chemistry as opposed to political science or history, it seems like the desire to sort of judge people on the basis of their ideology as a precondition for perhaps according them full social standing in one context or another has just become the norm in our society. And I think I would agree with you that this is something that is conspicuously sort of, pushed on the political left. My question, though, is where does this come from? Because I think that I often suspect that there's a way that people talk about this where it seems as if the entire kind of genesis of the politicization of our culture generally springs from sort of a mass kind of ideological delusion. And indeed, it's possible for people to be in serious error, in terms of their worldview and perspectives on various different things. But are there not life experiences that are sort of providing some of the context for the emotion that's going into a lot of these perspectives and why they're so ubiquitous today? I'll give you an example from my own life here. I grew up in a sort of a unique sort of fashion, I guess, somewhat. I'm biracial, black and white. That's not too terribly unique in and of itself. But I'm the product of a family that is both black and white, left and right. My mother's liberal Democrat from South Central Los Angeles. My father's conservative Republican from Tennessee, although he grew up more of a Kennedy Democrat. Felt that the party left him behind, of course. And my mother came from a much poorer background. My father grew up in great wealth in Bel Air and Beverly Hills and so forth. I grew up in multicultural, middle-class Culver City, sort of bouncing back and forth from all of these different environments. And it had seemed to me that you cannot characterize, let's take the Black experience because it's what I know best. You cannot characterize the Black experience in America, broadly speaking, by one Black person or another. But it seems clear to me that for a lot of Black folks who grew up in inner city LA, like my wife, who grew up in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts, that there's a qualitatively different experience that a lot of folks are, living under, that makes it a lot more difficult to sort of see the United States of America as the land of promise that it is, I think, easy for me to see it as, and for you yourself to see it as. When the LA riots took place in 1992, I was 5 years old. My wife was 4 years old. I barely remember it. I was in Culver City at the time. I sort of have a background memory of there being a lot of tension in our house, and my mother stepped out the door to go to work. My father was terribly worried, but she came back okay. My wife, at the age of 4, 15 minutes and 15 miles away from me, was living in a war zone. I mean, she remembers gunfire. She remembers sirens blaring. She remembers people running outside, having to lay on the floor to avoid gun bullets traveling through the window potentially. And over the course of her upbringing in that particular area, and my wife was a soldier for a certain period of time, but she saw more death and more violence, growing up in that area than some folks, I think, see serving in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I mean that without exaggeration, because I know her story as well. Dr. King lamented after his, shortly before his assassination, that in spite of the gains of the civil rights movement, that there were deep problems facing the progress of African Americans that was baked in largely into many of the ways in which our policies work, and into sort of perhaps an attitude of complacency that he felt many white Americans had towards the larger uplift of African Americans. I guess the feeling was that while many folks in America were appalled by the brutality of, your Bull Connors and Jim Clarks and your folks in the segregated South, that nevertheless there was not an earnest desire to confront the complexity of the issues that continue to lock African Americans into a disadvantaged place in this country. My sense is that in the context of the Black experience, at least, but that, perhaps we can say similar things about other groups of people, there's this way in which at least part of what's happening is that you have a celebration of progress in American society that is justified by perhaps the life experiences of folks like myself and some other people, but that many, many other people still feel locked out of this American dream in a deep and bitter and frustrating sort of way, that it makes it difficult to appreciate this larger narrative of perhaps American exceptionalism that comes naturally to others. And so I'm wondering, and don't feel the need to spare my feelings if you take me as being in error, but I am wondering if you see any legitimacy in that overview, and of course, why or why not?
A lot of Blacks are locked out of the American dream. The question is it white's fault? That's the, if you come to a doctor and your heart is not functioning well, we can all agree your heart is not functioning well, but if we don't find out why, you'll die. Mm-hmm. So it's very important to figure out the genesis, the origins, or as the scientists say, the etiology of these problems. So I have a truly simple view. It's not simplistic. Simple is very different from simplistic. I don't like simplistic views, but I do like simple views. Right. And here is my simple view, that almost any American who embraces Judeo-Christian and middle-class values will get ahead. That's it. And if you have an 80% out of wedlock rate in any community, that community will not prosper. If that community is Hispanic, white, or Black, it's doomed. The issue is not white privilege. The issue is two-parent privilege. Mm-hmm. The issue is church community privilege or synagogue community privilege. There are a whole host of privileges that have nothing to do with color. I'm a values man.
Right.
So if you embrace constructive values, you'll do well in America. And that's true for everybody.
Well, you know, the thing that I think more than anything else, certainly on the practical level of how is it that we lift up folks who need lifting up, and how is it that we move communities forward into progress. The thing that anchors me to the label conservative is that I look at individual initiative. I look at communal cohesion, you know, familial integrity. I look at our ability to make the most of ourselves and each other in the context of our individual enterprise and our social relationships as being sort of the master variable, that regardless of what may be put in front of you in life, you've got your best chance of being able to overcome if you make yourself most capable of overcoming. And I think that there's a deep relationship between that sort of empowerment of the individual, empowerment of the family, empowerment of the community, and the values upon which we operate that, of course, are deeply encoded in faith and religion. So again, I think deep point of agreement with you on that. What I wonder, though, is there anything in the truth of that observation that would suggest that we ought not be actively concerned with policy and with the ways in which society might be structured or operating in a way as to where, I mean, even if nobody means it to be this way, that there might be, as a consequence of the way policies operate, et cetera, barriers that are more present in the experiences of some groups of folks rather than others. I'll give you a little bit of an example. I mean, just sort of a hypothetical sort of analogy, I guess. I'm not much of a basketball player. You're taller than I am. You would have been picked for center, I imagine, in a pickup game, generally speaking. But if you and I were on the basketball court, and you know, if you were given a 10-point advantage in a one-on-one match to 12, I would put my money on Dennis Prager, I think. Now, if you were, on the other hand, to swap me out for LeBron James, you could give Dennis Prager a 10-point head start. You're probably not going to get a single shot on LeBron. The game is rigged against LeBron in both cases, so to speak. But, you know, you've got an individual who's exceptional at the task at hand, who is able to sort of overcome the obstacles in front of him, even with things going against them. So we should all work on, if we're going to be basketball players, being the best basketball players we can be. But I guess the question becomes, is the way in which we see our sort of, policies and so forth set up in American society, we'll just put it like this. Are things as fairly sort of arranged in terms of policy in American life as we would like them to be? And if they're not, does it not stand to reason that people would feel a great deal of urgency in overcoming some of these barriers that might seem to be set in place by the ways in which our policies and institutions may be operating, even in the years following the civil rights movement?
Two quick answers. One, life is not fair, period. And there are people who are born with talents that others are not. Mm-hmm. And we all recognize that. And no matter how hard I would have tried, I'm 6'4", but I have zero talent in basketball. And so the guy who was 5'10" with talent would have creamed me. It wouldn't have even been close. Mm-hmm. Talent and a whole host of other built-in things are advantageous. Life is not fair to begin with. But as regards color, well, I'll put one answer in terms of a question. Mm-hmm. if you were to apply today or in the last 25 years to Harvard, two equally competent people, one black, one white, who do you think has a better chance of getting into Harvard? It's a rhetorical question, because if one says it's the white, one is fooling oneself. Okay, so this conflation of 1930 or 40 or with 2020 is ridiculous. In the life that I have largely experienced, and I'm not a young guy, the country has not been conspiring against black people. And I'll give a Jewish example that many of your viewers would not be familiar with. The United States had a lot of anti-Jewish policies. Jews could not buy homes in many areas. It would even say, no Jews welcome. Jews could not enter country clubs in many instances. Most big law firms did not allow Jews. In fact, one of the reasons for many Jewish law firms is that they had to make their own. My father was born in America, but was an Orthodox Jew, and he went to City College of New York and wrote his senior class thesis on anti-Semitism in America. However, my wise father, I had a wise father as well, my father raised my older brother and myself to believe that we were the luckiest Jews in Jewish history to live in America with all its anti-Semitism. And he was entirely right. I've written a book on anti-Semitism. I taught Jewish history at Brooklyn College. I know this subject very, very well. An American Jew is the luckiest Jew outside of Israel, and a Black American is usually the luckiest Black in the world anywhere. And that is heresy at the university. To speak of Blacks in America as lucky is almost an absurdity in the eyes of academia, but it is a fact, and I have a proof. Millions of Blacks have moved to this country from Black Africa and the Black Caribbean. And why would they do that if America is systemically racist? There's only one possible reason. They're stupid. There is no other reason. No Jews moved to Germany in the 1930s. Why not? Because they weren't stupid. So for the white and Black leftist, they must regard these millions of Blacks coming here from Africa as stupid. Why would you leave a Black society for a systemically racist white society? You have to be out of your mind. Or there is another possibility. They're not out of their mind, and it's a gigantic lie that America is systemically anti-Black.
Yeah, I have to admit, I experience a certain sense of disconnection when I hear folks sort of make the observations that you're describing, people who may be in positions of authority and influence, let's say on a college campus, who would make the case that the institution that they work at perhaps is systemically racist, while they themselves and everybody else on faculty are sort of doing everything that they can do to uplift the voices of the folks who are being identified as marginalized. And of course, this seems to be a pattern across mainstream society. It's weird. You have people who seem to sort of admit to racism, even while outwardly sort of committing themselves to abolish the racism that they implicitly sort of claim to be guilty of. And so it seems like this very sort of difficult psychological kind of situation to unpack for people. I want to circle back to that point, though, and put another thing on the table, another point of agreement that we have. And you mentioned the fact that Black people in America typically are the most fortunate, Black people in the world. And, that has to be true to some degree, or to greater or lesser extent. But if you look at a person like myself, I wrote an article appeared in Persuasion magazine, where I talked about this concept of privilege. I have, been in conversations, certainly with, folks on the left, white and black, et cetera, where I make the honest claim that, I am a highly privileged individual. I mean, I really am, not only am I, do I consider myself to be privileged? I mean, I grew up in a two-parent home. Financially, we weren't, wealthy in my particular, in my household. My grandparents had means, but we didn't live high on the hog. But nevertheless, every possible, opportunity was afforded me. And in the context of the socially progressive school district that I went to, being a person of mixed, heritage and so forth, I always sort of had the conspicuous sense that folks are really rooting for me, even where, a kid who, and I can remember, this is not just me being hypothetical. I mean, I can remember a kid who came from a trailer park in Tennessee, found his way into our school, and I had difficulty keeping up academically. People showed him very little interest, whereas folks of color who may be coming in from another country were given a special introduction to the class and told, "Hey, this person comes from a different place, is learning the language, but let's have everybody make him or her feel at home." Um, I have various privileges, not just on account of being an American, but also on account, I think, of being a multicultural, mixed race American in a certain sort of ideological space. And as such, I consider myself to be far more privileged than millions of white people in American society who may be suffering from the opioid epidemic in the Rust Belt, who may be suffering from poverty in Appalachia or the rural South. People who are, I think, deeply sensitive to the fact that in the mainstream of our culture, folks like them, the wrong kind of white folks, are not valued on university campuses. We don't want to highlight their presence in America, in Hollywood or the entertainment industry. These are people who we sort of look down on in mainstream American life, I think, because they're not just are they white, but they're the wrong kind of white folks and so forth. And so privilege is not a strict function of race, in my view. But I did mention the fact that I do see there as being, just as there's variety in the experiences of white Americans, there's obviously great variety in the experiences of African Americans as well. Coming out of the civil rights movement, just to return to that point in history, most of the gains of the civil rights movement accrued in the South. And at that time, most African Americans already lived in big cities, most of them outside of the South. You were able to roll back the clock on Jim Crow, so on and so forth. But, other folks, I think, saw life change very little over the course of the civil rights movement, and then rolled right into the era of mass incarceration in the 70s and 80s. And right now, I think we're living in a moment, 80s and certainly early 90s, we're living in a moment where so much of the experience of many people of color was sort of formed in the crucible of those years, particularly in inner city communities and so forth. And it seems to me that there's something very complicated going on in America right now, where you have folks coming out of these communities where people grew up differently than I did, not whose cultural upbringing was, I think, also impacted potentially by the structural circumstances around them. And so I want to get into the subject of culture and ask you if you see it as connecting to policy any, because it seems to me like policy probably does have an impact on the cultural circumstances that people grow up in. If you have mass incarceration, if you have an absence of economic opportunity, if you have social policies which discourage the formation of the family, two-parent households, and a range of other things, you might find yourself in a context where people are raised with values born of some desperation, values that are forged in the context of very difficult life struggles. And so you you have that in addition to the fact that there are just, sort of differences in the cultural aesthetics of different groups. People have a certain dialect. They have, different sorts of names in the Black community. My name is John Wood Jr. It is not, an archetypically sort of Black name, so on and so forth. And from all of this, people wind up going into the institutions. They go to the universities. They go into corporations, so on and so forth. And I think that a lot of people have in the rearview mirror a history of deep suffering that I think has some relationship, at least, with policies that don't just impact them materially, but affect the cultural formation of groups. And then they don't feel like they quite fit in, I think, as they head off to college, as they go off into the boardroom, into the classroom, or what have you. And so that, when I look at it that way, what we're looking at starts to make a little bit more sense to me, in as much as I think that there is something, deeply troubling about the way in which, even if culture is the core issue and also the core solution, I think that there's a way in which culture, I think, has probably been impacted by policy that positions people to, one, feel like the problem of racism in American life has never ended, and two, to feel like they're on the outside looking in terms of their social belonging, even as they move upwards even as they move upward upon the institutional ladder and social ladder of American life. So I hope that there's not too much on that plate there, but I'd love to hear you respond to just sort of the thrust of that analysis.
Yeah, there was a very real policy that kept Blacks down. That was the paternalistic state that said, we'll give you money. You don't have to work. This was true with whites today. It is true with the Hispanics. And it was, but it was done originally to ameliorate Black issues, as Tom Sowell, one of the greatest thinkers of the last century, last 50 years at least, in the United States, Black economist, has demonstrated the Black family in the 1930s was actually more solid than the white family. Children were more likely to have two parents in a Black family in the 1930s, which was way closer to slavery, by the way, and where there was far more Jim Crow than later. So what destroyed the Black family was not the white racism, unless, of course, you hold, as I do, that the left is racist, which I do deeply believe. I think the left has deep contempt for Blacks. That's why they always change the standards. They don't believe Blacks can live up to the same standard. Affirmative action is a perfect example of a belief that if you keep the standards the same, Blacks will fail. I don't believe that. Leftists believe that. And so the Great Society ushered in dramatically the time of the single Black mother, then the single Hispanic mother, then the single white mother. So yeah, policies matter. When people marry, it's unbelievable simple. Graduate high school and do not have a baby before you marry, and get a job, and you will succeed in the United States of America. I don't know if you'll be CEO or an all-star shortstop, but you will succeed. And that's true no matter what your color. So we're living in the largest lie in American history, indeed one of the largest in world history. American whites are white supremacists. Blacks are living in a systemically racist society. They are the biggest national lie since the blood libel in the Middle Ages. The blood libel was the charge that Jews killed Christian babies to use their blood to bake matzah for Passover. That was the biggest. It's called the blood libel because many Jews were murdered because of that lie. America is being murdered because of this lie. This is the second largest national lie. It's a good country. And if you want to walk around thinking that you're the object of racism and hatred and bigotry, and LeBron James is afraid to leave his house because he doesn't know if he'll get killed that day, that's the man. If he believes that, I don't believe he believes it. I think he's lying. But if he's telling the truth, he's sick. So we have a choice between his being sick, psychologically sick, or lying. Oprah Winfrey lamenting life as a Black in America. I mean, you got to give me a break. I can't take these people seriously. So this is a terrible choice people make, to think of themselves as victims. Even if you are a victim, it's a terrible choice. I wrote a book on happiness many years ago. It's still widely read. Happiness is a serious problem. And I have a chapter on the victim mentality. If you think you're a victim, you cannot be happy. It's as simple as that. Yeah. And unhappy people are usually angry. So this is what you have. I'm a victim. I'm unhappy. I'm angry that I'm a victim, and I'm angry that I'm unhappy. And this is what white leftists and Black leftists have conspired to convince Blacks of. You are a victim, and we are living the consequences.
Yeah, I think that I think, well, first of all, let me again agree. I think that there is a certain there's a certain very real sort of hysteria that I think you see kind of, coming from folks who are immensely privileged in the context of American life, wherein they seem to put themselves forward as being equally, vulnerable to the, to the life and death sorts of outcomes that I think actually are a real concern for too many people in America, and too many African Americans who grew up a certain way in a certain set of circumstances that I've already, talked a bit about here. Circumstances that I think are sort of locked in place a bit by the history of policy and just sort of the larger history that we trail behind us, which is not to say that ultimately these things cannot be overcome by the resources that we bring to them through an individual initiative, through perseverance. So that seems clear to me. But I think that the reason why it seems important for me to make to sort of give voice to this other storyline, if you will, is one, to try and sort of fill out the picture a bit from my perspective, in terms of, I think why it is that people who are well-meaning and reasonable can look at American society and say, well, we have certainly not progressed as far as we ought to have, and perhaps tell ourselves that we have, when you can identify, millions of folks locked in inner city poverty and in context of violence, and when you have these sort of, experiences of people who feel what may be a lesser order of problem, it may be sort of a first world problem in a real way, but nevertheless, you have, I think, some real experiences of sort of, social dislocation as people move from ethnic communities into mainstream cultural life, which affects the way they see things. I think that these are real experiences that are riding underneath the larger conversation that we're having. The reason it's important to emphasize these things to me is not because at the end of the day it changes necessarily my fundamental analysis of what we need to accomplish in American life. So again, I mean, I'm a person who my great role models in the history of the Black, in the context of the Black freedom tradition, and I have many, but Martin Luther King Jr. and Booker T. Washington stand out to me chiefly. And Booker T. Washington, because he was an institution builder who marshaled the potential of the people that he was serving and representing, so as to help people become educated and educate themselves, so as to develop skills that would allow them to contribute value back into society, to use the platform that he had to be able to broadcast the values of entrepreneurialism and service, that allowed him to scale up that culture through the Tuskegee Institute. And he used all of that to advocate politically for the African-American community. This is something that was built from the ground up. And you probably not aware, but, I work with Bob Woodson, 1776 Unites project. And I consider Bob to be the closest thing we have to a modern day Booker T. Washington. And, to me, the importance of this work, the fundamental importance of this work, does not negate policy conversations that ought to be had. There's a real conversation that we need to be able to move forward on the educational system. Is the public school system, is the problem a lack of funding, or is it a lack of choice? These key sorts of questions, litter the landscape. And I think that ideally we would be able to intelligently engage them without taking our eyes off the prize in terms of the uplift that needs to be marshaled within the community. That's my particular perspective. But to bring it back to Braver Angels very quickly, it seems to me that all of this is for naught if it is the case, or if we merely reconcile ourselves to the idea that there is no hope for us in being able to sustain the relationships between the American people, between significant portions of the American people, not just tiny little fringes, out on the left and the right, such that we can work together to operate our democratic republic in the service of the common welfare of all of us. So, but in order to accomplish that, Mr. Prager, it has seemed to me, and what I've dedicated myself to, it seems to me that there's a project of fostering communication that is vital there. I try to be very generous when engaging, and I'm just talking about myself, not putting this on anybody else. This is the road that I've chosen, right? But I try to be very generous, engaging, left or right, but to keep it focused on the left here for a second, on the areas in which I feel like folks, out on the social justice left, even if I disagree with major, swaths of the analysis they're putting forward, and also even if I, am disturbed by, all sorts of, tactical things that I see coming from that side of the conversation. A separate body of criticisms I could talk about on the right, but again, to stay focused on the left, I try my very best to identify as much as I can where the justifiable concerns may lie, so as to signal for my part the fact that I am interested in solving problems that, at bottom, if there's some humanity there on the left, that it must be the case that they care about too, right? I try to forge that space of common concern around which, I seek, and at Braver Angels, we seek to create the context for people to thoughtfully engage on the differences that they have with each other. And for me, the root of that approach lies in the philosophy of nonviolence. It lies in the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. described the nonviolent philosophy. Really, it was a spiritual philosophy of social change. And the root of it was this idea that in loving your opposition, and by love, he didn't mean, affection or affectionate friendship or romance or anything like that. It's the idea of agape love, which you can really just sort of interpret as goodwill. And that's really sort of the term I chiefly use. But through goodwill and through the insistence on demonstrating goodwill, that we allow ourselves to speak the full truth of what we believe while maximizing our potential for being able to reach the conscience or reach the human center, the center of reason in the opposition. And, that does not always materialize in the space of a single conversation, clearly. But if you go back to the context of the civil rights movement, and, this is not for me to, this is not me necessarily drawing a qualitative equivalency between, modern social justice activists and, members of the Ku Klux Klan or what have you. But I would argue that that approach genuinely did succeed in changing the hearts of Americans, broadly speaking, including folks who are very hardened in prejudice and in bigotry. And it had that impact, and that impact, I think, grew over time. I mean, George Wallace himself had a change of heart before the end of his life. Jerry Falwell's views evolved. To be perfectly honest with you, Mr. Prager, I literally think I might not exist if it weren't for that cultural change. I mean, well, just to make the point that, I'm in part a product of a white Southern family, and the idea of interracial marriage, even though, my family was always admiring of Black people and Black culture, but, my existence was not necessarily something that would have been seen as an inevitably good thing given where they were coming from. But people change. I retain some belief in the efficacy of what King called Christian love, but really is just sort of the substance of nonviolence. Again, this idea of goodwill to set the stage for us to find each other again as human beings. And so for me, that is the project I have committed to, because I haven't quite given up hope, even at this late hour, that there's good work to be done there that can set the stage for us to be able to preserve the integrity and the enduring promise of our American institutions and of the American dream. And so I simply put that before you for your appraisal.
I wish you good luck, and I don't think you will have good luck. The left is not comparable to the conservatives. The left want to destroy America. They want to destroy the West. They believe that Beethoven was not great. He's only honored because he's white. Shakespeare was not great. He's only honored because he was white. Everything good is opposed by the left, not by liberals. Liberals are naive, and so they vote left, which is the tragedy of America, that liberals don't understand that we conservatives are their allies. Liberals believe in free speech, the left does not. Everywhere the left has been in power, the left is a much larger issue than America. Lenin has a great deal in common with Adam Schiff and with George Soros. The left, I've studied the left my whole life. I learned Russian, went to communist countries a great deal. Every refugee from a communist country, not every, most, will tell you that they see it happening in America, what they fled. So I wish you good luck, but this country is the last best hope on earth. As Lincoln said, the left thinks it's a cesspool. I don't know how you dialogue with people who think good is bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one has to have some confidence in the idea that hearts and minds are not fixed in stone for all time, necessarily.
That's true. I do wish you luck in that regard. My task is different from yours. I want to save this country from those who loathe it. So I would love to dialogue with them. They never dialogue, never. I have invited people on the left onto my show. I've been broadcasting 35 years. Everyone knows I treat people I differ with great politeness. I had Howard Zinn on my show, the biggest leftist of all. He was one of the few who would come on, but you could listen to that. It's on YouTube. You could see how nicely I treated him, but they never debate because they're afraid to. Their views are not rooted in reality. They're not rooted in intellectual solidity. They're all passion. It's all passion. It's all anger. So we're in a crisis. This is the first time in American history free speech is no longer universally held as a value. That's the left's doing. Liberals believe in free speech. Conservatives do. The left is not. So good luck.
Dennis, and I'm mindful of time, but what I pulled from what you just said, key part of what I pulled from what you just said is that you are willing to dialogue when others are willing to come to the table. And at Braver Angels,
with great joy.
And at Braver Angels, of course, that is precisely what we seek to do, is to bring folks to the table. And so, as we labor to make that happen, I hope to be able to extend an invitation to you again. And I very much appreciate you coming on and having the frank conversation with me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Indeed. I will thank you very much, Dennis. And for everybody who is listening, if you appreciate the work of Braver Angels, if you would like to be involved in this mission, then join us. Our website is braverangels.org. You can come on board as a member. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. There is work to be done. We are building a house united. Until next time.